this session we're going to be looking at the enhanced REST client in PowerBuilder 2019. The first thing we're going to do is have a legal disclaimer. And now the agenda. I'm going to talk about myself for a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some of the enhancements, including the RetrieveOne method, the submit method, the SetRequestHeader method, how it's modified, how GZip compression capability has been added, how to get and set an OAuth token, how to get and set a JWT token, and there's a whole batch of new methods here. They all send and then a method name request. So there's a send, get requests, and put requests, and post requests, etc. Methods that have been added, and then we'll have questions and answers. So a little bit about myself. I've been using PowerBuilder since version 1. I quickly determined after I started using it that this is something that I could be an independent contractor using, and so I did that for about 15 years. And then after that decided I wanted to go back to working full-time for a company, and I started working for a company called Integrated Data Services. I've been there another 14 years. In addition to PowerBuilder, the development languages that I'm most fluent in are Oracle PL SQL, Java, C#, and it's not listed there, but C++ as well. I'm involved in a number of open source projects, not just the ones listed, but I thought the ones that I've listed there are probably the most significant. One of them is that in PowerBuilder 10, Sybase open source the PFC libraries, PowerBuilder Foundation class libraries, and I'm one of the people that contributes to maintaining that. A little bit about the company I work for. Okay, so let's look at the RetrieveOne method. So there is a retrieve method on the REST client that is for getting a result set, but let's say you just wanted to retrieve one row. Well, you couldn't do it using the retrieve method because the retrieve method is expecting an array. So what Appeon did is added a RetrieveOne method that just expects to get a single row back. Now, if you do use it to request data from a service that does return an array, it will only take the first row of that result set and add it to the data window. So here's an example of calling that, where I have a data window called DW1. This is my URL. What I'm asking for in this particular case is the post number 1, so I'm going to get a single row back, and that will then be retrieved into the data window. Okay, so there's a new submit method, and it can send data from a data window, a data store, or a JSON packager. It only uses the post method. It doesn't use the other verbs like get or delete or any of those. There's a couple different formats for it here. All of them take the URL that you're posting, the service you're posting to. The ref string response, the reason that's there, that's where that's where you're getting the response back. Notice that you're submitting and getting a response in a single call, so that is different. And then this is the data window object that you're sending the data from, and then there's a flag indicating the format. So if you're familiar with some of my other presentations, I talk about the different formats. There's a simplified JSON format, which is just the JSON data, the way that you normally see JSON presented by other tools. But there's also a more complex JSON format that PowerBuilder generates that's PowerBuilder specific. And what it does is it has metadata in it about the data window that the data came from. It has the data broken up into the buffers, primary, deleted, filter buffers that that the data window has. So it also has row and column status information. It's essentially the JSON format of the get and set full state blob that was used with distributed PowerBuilder. So you have a choice of which way to send it. So if you're calling a service that is based in PowerBuilder, you can send the more complex format and make it easier for the back end to determine how to process the data, since it would have the data window and would be able to handle the data window buffers appropriately. There's another version of this where you can indicate whether or not you want to send all of the rows or just the rows that have changes. That's what this Boolean changed only is for. This next version, in this version here, the second version, we were you have the option to specify a particular data window buffer that you wanted to send the data from. In this version, you're actually selecting. You can select more than one of those buffers. So you can send data from the primary data buffer, the filter, the delete, and this is data window children. And then this version, you can actually pick a starting row, an end row, and a starting and ending column. And then this last one is for if you want to use the JSON package to send the data rather than data window control. That's everything I was just talking about earlier, right there. So here's an example of using this. This is from a RESTClient sample that I did for last year's Elevate, where I've just modified it to use these new methods. So here's the submit method. This is for updating posts. This is response data coming back. This is the data window I'm sending the data from. I'm sending the primary buffer. I have to go back and see what that was. Well, in this case, I'm just sending I'm doing one row. That's I'm doing the start row, end row. Let's say I'm using this fourth version here. So I'm just sending one row for the update. And I'm saying false because the particular service I'm calling here is not PowerBuilder based. It expects simple JSON. And so the false indicates to send simple JSON. So for SetRequestHeader, there's been a change. There's an optional, new optional replace argument. What would happen is that if you did a SetRequestHeader and you gave it a header name and a value, and then later in your script you did that same thing with that same header name, it would get added twice, and you might have conflicting values for your header value. So the Boolean replace indicates that if the value already exists in the header, replace it, and that way you only end up with that single header value. The default is the old behavior, which is add the value even if it already exists. Okay. Next item is GZip functionality. So the servers have an ability, many services have the ability to send the data down in GZip format. And what you need to do, if they do support that, is you send a header flag indicating in your request, indicating that you can handle GZip data. And it's the accept encoding header. So if you set the accept encoding header in your service call, and the service supports GZip, it will send the data in GZip. And if not, the service will ignore your header and just send the data back in regular uncompressed JSON format. The thing is, though, what PowerBuilder does, though, is if it sees the data coming back in GZip format, it automatically handles it. So you don't have to do anything on special to process the results. The only thing you have to do is do this SetRequestHeader except encoding GZip true. And if the service does GZip compression, it will send it GZipped. If not, it won't. Either way, the rest of your code doesn't need to change. PowerBuilder will automatically unencode, unzip essentially the data if it comes in GZip format. Otherwise, it will just handle the regular JSON. And I've got an example here where I call a really large result set from the USGS in order to show the benefit you get from having the data gzipped. For example, this is if when the header was not set, so the data came back as just plain JSON, and the data was half a megabyte in size, and it took 1.4 seconds to download all of the data. When I said it's called the same method, and all I did was change that single request header to say that I accepted GZip data. Now instead of a half a megabyte of data, I got 20K of data back because it was compressed down from a half a meg to 20K, and it only took 0.7 seconds. So it was twice as fast to retrieve the data that way. Okay, OAuth. We had OAuth support in earlier versions of PowerBuilder, but this has been streamlined a bit. There is a get OAuth token method where you send in the request and you get the token back. This is the same object that was used by the OAuth client, so that part hasn't changed. You can put together the token request the same way. It's just available now on the REST client. And then you use the set OAuth token to take that token you just got back and apply it to the method that's then going to use the OAuth token. So this was an example I had once again last year for contacting Twitter, which has been modified now to use the new approach for the OAuth token. So this all up here, this didn't really change. I'm taking the username, password, the client ID secret, the grant type, all that hasn't changed. What I have done though is I'm creating the client request, and I'm using this new get OAuth token. So I'm not using the OAuth client class. I'm using a function on the REST client itself, and I pass in the request, and I get the access token back. And then that was my original request for the token. This is my method now where I'm going to actually do my request for data, and all I do is just before I make that call, I do the set OAuth token and give it the access token that we got earlier. Okay. Next topic is JSON Web Tokens. This is completely new. So there's actually a number of different ways for handling authentication in REST web services. One of the more popular ones is JSON Web Tokens. And a JSON Web Token is actually composed of multiple parts. There is a header that indicates what algorithm is being used, and then the type of JWT is pretty well fixed. There's a set of claims that includes things like the username, what kind of authorities they have in the service. Those two pieces of information are then hashed and then signed, and then that signing information is then added as the third component. So you can actually see that this is when this is encoded, it becomes this in red. When this is encoded, you get this purple piece, and then this is the signature piece that's added at the very end. So that's what a JSON Web Token looks like. Okay, so there's actually in practice, there's actually a few different scenarios about how these JSON Web Tokens are used. This first scenario is you take a user ID password and you pass it up to the REST application. The REST application creates a JSON Web Token request and passes it off to identity service. The identity service generates a bearer token, which is then returned to the client. What the client then does is every time it makes a subsequent request, it sends the bearer token. The REST application then takes that bearer token, passes it back to the identity service to determine if the bearer token is actually valid. If the bearer token is valid, the identity service returns the OK to go ahead and return the data, and then the REST application returns the data. So that's one scenario. The one issue here is this user ID token, user ID password is being passed not necessarily in clear text, but because it would be in an SSL request. But it is not as secure as it could be. So you would want to use this mainly for internal applications. So there's a second scenario here. In this case, the client puts together the token request. So now the user information is encoded in the request. So it's more secure than the previous approach. That's sent to the REST application. The REST application verifies that the user is valid, that the claims they've made about the rights they have is valid, and then sends back the bearer token. And then everything else is pretty much the same as scenario one. You send the bearer token on your subsequent requests, and then if the bearer token is valid, you get your data back. The only difference really here is that in the first scenario, the JSON Web Token request that was put together was being done within the REST application. Here it's being done on the client and sent to the REST application. So this is more typically used for third-party APIs. And then there's this third scenario that's used by some services where instead of getting a bearer token back, what you do is you create your JSON Web Token request and you send it on every call, so that there's no bearer token that you need to revalidate. What happens is when the REST application parses the JSON Web Token request and determines whether or not the user is valid and their claims are valid, it's going to do that same process on every request it gets. So that's probably the most secure method, because you're not relying on this token that might be intercepted and reused by somebody else. And usually the tokens are only good for a certain period of time, let's say 15 minutes. But in that 15 minutes, somebody could grab that token and start sending in their own requests. And this pretty much prevents that possibility. Now I outlined there are three different REST methods, not REST methods, I'm sorry, JWT approaches. The get JSON Web Token and set JSON Web Token methods that are provided in PowerBuilder 2019 only support the first scenario, the one where you send in a username and password, you get a bearer token back, and you send back the bearer token on subsequent requests. The other two methods can be implemented as well, but they're going to need a little bit more work on the client end, and I've got a sample code that demonstrates how to address those other two scenarios. And if you go to the there's a session I'm doing on the C# capability that's been added in 2019, and it has a scenario for it has a sample code in it for scenario 1, and like I said, I've got some sample code I have as well for this session, which has demonstrates how to do such scenario 2 and scenario 3. So this is an example of scenario 1, where we're going to use the getJWT token and setJWT token. So I'm going to take the username and password. I'm going to put them together in a JSON payload. I'm going to call my getJWT token. This is the endpoint where we do the request for the JWT token. And I'm passing in this JSON payload that has the username and password in it. And I'm actually passing this string here. This is a string being passed by reference that the token's going to come back in. Once I get that token, I call set JWT token to set the token on the client for my subsequent requests. Okay, another new feature is all of these send method name request methods that have been added. Like the submit method I mentioned earlier, the request and the response is being handled in a single call. It's not in the initial methods that were added with the REST client. You did a submit, and then you separately called another method that retrieved the data. This has been simplified here. It's also an improvement over the submit method, because the submit method is only limited to a post. With all these send method name request methods, you have all the verbs, or at least all the commonly used verbs, available. So you have a SentGetRequest, a SendPostRequest, SendPatchRequest, SendPutRequest, and SendDeleteRequest. So that's pretty much most of the more common verbs being used. Notice that in a GET request, the only place you can send data in a GET request is actually in the URL as query parameters. But for the other methods, you do have the ability to send data as well, because the other methods do accept data in the request body rather than just in the URL. And then, as with the submit method, there is a string that's being passed in by reference that gets the response from the request. Okay, so we're going to look at some of the REST enhancements. Not all of them, just a few of them that demo better. So for the REST client, we had the retrieve method originally. We wanted a method that would return one row, and that's what the RetrieveOne method does. And so that's just retrieving one row from the service. I'm going to look at GZip next, but I want to look at the code for that. And the reason I want to do that is because it actually demonstrates one of the other features, new features. There was an optional argument added to SetRequestHeader. So by default, this is false, which means that every time you say SetRequestHeader and you provided a value, it just tacks it on to the request. So that if I called this 2 or 3 times, it would just keep adding this over and over again to the request. With this set to true, what it will do is when it will set the request header, if it finds a request header of that same value already, it replaces it. So it doesn't keep adding the same request header over and over again. So that's that going on. But for GZip, the only thing we're doing here, the difference between having GZip on or off, is I'm just checking that checkbox and adding that request header if it's set to true. So everything else is handled for us automatically by PowerBuilder and by the server we're calling. So this particular service I'm calling here is the USGS, and I'm going to do a request for data here, and I get back raw JSON in an uncompressed format. Okay. Now I'm going to say use GZip. Now that's just all that's going to do. It's going to add that request header. Now the USGS server does handle GZip. If the server doesn't handle GZip, it's going to ignore that request header and send you just uncompressed JSON. But if it does accept that request header, then it will send you the data in a compressed format, and then PowerBuilder will automatically decompress it. So we'll hit get data again, and we get the data. You don't see any real difference here, but what happened there is that the data got compressed by the USGS before it sent it down, and the PowerBuilder automatically decompressed it. So the end result is that the data was transmitted faster, and in less data was sent because it was in a compressed format. I mean, same amount of data, but it was compressed. So anyway, you understand what I mean. Last thing I would show you here is JSON Web Token. I mentioned in the session that there's actually at least three different ways of doing JSON Web Tokens. Scenario 1, Scenario 2, and Scenario 3. Scenario 1 is you pass in username, password. Internally, the service you're calling generates a JSON Web Token, hands it off to an identity service. The identity service hands you back a bearer token. The bearer token is sent back down to the client, and in subsequent requests, the client sends the bearer token on its request. That's what AirMap does. That's your Scenario 1. That's the one that's more native to PowerBuilder. It's more directly supported by PowerBuilder. Scenario 2, DocuSign uses. You put together a JSON Web Token. You call a service specifically for handling that JSON Web Token request. It evaluates your JSON Web Token, and it sends you back a bearer token. Then you go ahead and call the API using that bearer token on every request. That's Scenario 2. Scenario 3 is the sailing group. What they do, they don't have a specific essentially login method that you send your JSON Web Token to and get a bearer token. You don't get a bearer token. What you do is you create your JSON Web Token, and you send it on every request you send to their API. And every method on their API knows that it needs to process that JSON Web Token to evaluate whether or not you're allowed to see the data, and then sends you the data. So there's no separate login, and there's no bearer token. It's just a JSON Web Token being sent every request. So we'll look at a couple of these. This is AirMap. So I sent in my JSON Web Token. Actually, I sent in my user ID and password, and I got a bearer token back. But there's JSON Web Token going on in the middle tier there. This actually came back in an OAuth format, so it tells you when it expires. This is the access token here, but there's actually more information down here beyond that. And then I say, do my request to the service. There's a number of APIs you can call in AirMap. AirMap, DocuSign maybe more people are familiar with. AirMap is a service for if you're a drone operator and you need to get information about your flight path that you're going to send your drone on. That's what you use AirMap for, is to get that information. Anyway, there's a number of APIs you can call in AirMap that don't require the JSON Web Token. But accessing your own profile does. It'll only show you information about yourself. It won't show you information about other operators. And so the fact that it gave me back my own information means that it did accept my JSON Web Token. We'll look at sailing group. This is the other extreme where what I did. I didn't make any calls there. This is the JSON Web Token I generated. This is what I'm going to include on every call I make to the sailing group. So now I'm going to request a list of their stores, and that's information about a number of different stores that belong to the sailing group. So that's it. That's JSON Web Token, a couple different scenarios. Scenario 2 and Scenario 3 aren't quite as directly supported by PowerBuilder, but obviously you can see here you can do it using PowerBuilder. It just takes a little bit more work. So that's it. Okay, that was it. Any questions?